The corporate world is awash with jargon, and ESG is absolutely no exception. We talk about net zero. What does net zero even mean? This time, we're going to be looking at the issue of corporate jargon. We're going to be looking at net zero. We're going to be looking at these transitions that have to happen as we take the world of ESG considerably more seriously into the future, so that the children of the future will have that future far less dependent on carbon than we have been to date. So it's all about jargon. ESG in itself is jargon enough. But Nigel, when it comes to the jargon of ESG and this idea of net zero, everyone's talking about, we must get to net zero. Absolutely right, we must get to net zero. Does anybody actually know what that means?
Bruce, I think you're right. There's a lot of jargon. I think there's a lot of terminology that has evolved. People used to talk about kind of carbon neutral. Now everybody's talking about net zero. When people talk about net zero, generally what they mean is it looks across all greenhouse gases. It doesn't look at just carbon dioxide. Being kind of carbon neutral, look very much at just carbon dioxide, and it looks at scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So in other words, it doesn't look at just your direct emissions, but it also looks at your supply chain. So in other words, an all-encompassing kind of theme, very much aligned to how we're going to achieve Paris, so how we're going to achieve the specific goals that were signed up by the various countries aligned to Paris.
And that's at COP26, of course, which you
Well, that was COP21.
21, beg your pardon. You see, I haven't been to all the COPs.
No. There's been a lot of them. There's been 26 of them. And there's been more and more attendance as it goes along. 21 was the one in Paris. The one recently, COP26, was the one in Edinburgh.
How realistic is this goal of net zero? Because, there are just so many emissions each and every single day, of some of which we're aware, many of which we're probably not.
So I think let's understand, kind of the net zero, it's a journey. You're never going to be there immediately, but the idea is what the world is trying to do is try and get countries and corporates to commit to this type of journey. The idea is that if you're not measuring something, you wouldn't be able to reduce it. Mm-hmm. So the pressure is on for specific corporates and their supply chains to understand their carbon footprint over those scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, how you're managing it, and how you're going to reduce it over the kind of the short, medium, and long term.
I don't get a sense that the South African government is talking about this particularly much. I see this as a large corporate initiative. Phil, is that a fair enough observation?
I think the South African government, when they went over to COP26 now, I think really did do particularly well in terms of, putting South Africa in terms of on the front foot, in terms of the need for energy transition within SA, being able to really do particularly well in terms of striking the deal around that 8.5 billion financing. So, I do think that the South African government is, really looking at this, but, just transition at SA is a complicated topic there, as you look to decarbonize, there's a lot of knock-on implications which I think really need to be taken into account.
We most certainly do. And this is where the corporate sector comes in, Julian, because one would think that this is an initiative that can actually be very effectively led by corporate commitments and their supply chains. We'll probably make far quicker progress that way.
And what you're seeing is that the leading corporates are actually driving the change. So Eskom's commitment to get to net zero has an implication for everyone, because they're saying their supply chain is going to be net zero. And it does mean that you have to stop using coal unless you have a carbon capture and storage solution. And so this is already happening. And I think a lot of large corporates are driving that. We've got a net zero ambition. So this is going to pull more and more companies into that web because of the integrated supply chain aspect of that.
Where are we, Nigel, in terms of the tipping point towards net zero? I sort of feel like we're still very much
as
loaded.
A country.
As a country, broadly speaking, and then corporate
I think we're finding our feet. So, we've made commitments as a country. We've obviously signed Paris. UNFCCC, we're signatories to. We've got our nationally determined contributions that which is essentially a carbon budget. That carbon budget has now been refined, and it's actually been made a little bit more aggressive. So as a country, I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand exactly what our country's footprint is. Let's call it that. So, very much through the carbon tax and certain of these type of mechanisms is to basically say to society, you need to go out, you need to understand exactly what your carbon footprint is, and we're going to aggregate that, understand where we are, and then be able to tweak it according to where we want to get to. So in other words, how do we tweak those specific commitments to achieve kind of the net zero commitment that we want to do as a country by 2050.
So 2050 is the line in the sand, is the line. And are we it's early stages, but are we on track to even getting way closer?
I mean, if you look at, let's look at the major emitters. So the large carbon-intensive sectors is obviously the power sector. Mm-hmm. Between power and petrochemicals, that's about 60% of our emissions. For us to decarbonize the power sector is going to take a lot of work. At the moment, renewable energy accounts for about 6% of the energy in the power sector. It has been proven that to have a predominantly renewable energy power sector is the most cost-effective way. So to try and achieve that net zero is going to require about 150 gigawatts of renewable energy installation over the next 30 years. Now, that's about a 3 trillion rand investment. And obviously, that's going to take a lot of work. We're not there now, but there needs to be done.
It's a lot of work, it's a lot of money, but it's a lot of opportunity. We keep talking about the opportunity of ESG and the opportunity of private sector investors coming in and saying, government doesn't have to pay for this. We're happy to be paid over a 10-year lifespan of this particular facility, so let's do it this way, and we'll do it for less than a Mudupi or Kusile can generate energy for.
I love it. And kind of, the real opportunity for jobs, as much as there's such a risk in, it's a reality of jobs will be lost in the coal sector, will be lost in automotive, agriculture, as this transition process happens. There are new sectors which can get created in all of this. So within the renewable sector, there's opportunity for jobs, during solar and wind turbine construction. There are opportunities for other sectors to be created. And so, to really be looking at that and say, yes, there are some hard changes to be made as we decarbonize, but really be aware of these are the opportunities that we can kind of access along the way.
But Julian, it takes a plan, it takes a strategy, it takes a long-term decarbonization strategy. Who is the ringmaster, if you like, of the South African decarbonization strategy? Because you can have lots of little empires doing their own things, but somebody's got to pull it all together.
Look, I'm not absolutely convinced that you do need to have a top-down command and control structure to decarbonization. I think by setting the objective and getting the public support behind that, then you start to solve the problems within the private sector on a case-by-case basis. You need to get certain elements of shared infrastructure right. We need to get transmission solved. But command and control hasn't got a very good track record, and certainly not in the South African context. So, maybe that's not something that we want to really explore.
And we don't want to encourage government, I suppose, to take control of a process and start regulating a process, because the best regulation, ultimately, is an economic self-regulation, Nigel.
Yes, and I think just to add on to what Julian's saying, it's going to be very much around collaboration. So I think it's not command and control. What we're looking for is collaboration. And it's something we've not seen before. So if we look at various different industries are going to have to collaborate for us to achieve this net zero. So, for example, the different mining companies are going to have to work together. Eskom is going to have to be working with the mining sector. Sasol is going to have to work with Eskom. The financial institutions are going to have to be playing their part as well, as well as civil society. So the idea for us to achieve this, and that was something that was quite interesting that came out of COP, was for the first time, I moderated a panel of the different CEOs, was actually all the CEOs were talking. And they were essentially singing off the same hymn sheet. They were trying to work together. And that was the collaboration that we need to move the economy forward and for us to achieve these specific targets.
Specifically, how do you see it working in an ideal world?
So I think in an ideal world, it's going to be a case of us looking at the different sectors. So looking at the different sectors, trying to understand what that specific decarbonization could look like. And work has been done by that. So the National Business Initiative have actually done a lot of work, looked at modeling those specific sectors. The idea is then to be looking at a subsector level, looking at specific companies. How do the specific companies fit into that specific transition and that decarbonization strategy? How do they then look at it from a short term, a medium term, and a long term? So short term is something that might be relatively easy. It might be installation of renewable energy. It might be looking at energy efficiency in your own operations. Then you've got to start looking at medium term. How can you collaborate with your neighbor? How can there be opportunities for kind of circular economy? And then there's kind of the long term, which is what some people refer as kind of the last mile. That's the R&D that needs to be spent, that you don't know what it's going to look like, but it's going to be something that's going to get you over the line in the next, the final 10 to 15 years. That's the kind of the blue sky thinking. A lot of that's going to come through in, electric vehicles, green hydrogen, and a lot of these kind of concepts that at the moment are not commercially viable, but with the right level of effort will become commercially viable.
Julian, isn't that where the excitement is? Isn't that where the great opportunity is? In the first episode of this series, we spoke about the great opportunity that is being afforded to us by the shift towards ESG. And this is where the opportunity is. It sits in this incredible environment of new industries, new opportunities, and a reindustrialization opportunity for South Africa.
And absolutely, it's a massive opportunity overall. If you look at Qatar, for example, what happened to them after the discovery of gas, hydrogen has the potential to be that for South Africa. So we've got globally competitive renewable resources in country, and particularly for the mining industry, if they build a solar plant, a lot of the mines are going to be shut down, and you're still going to have a solar plant generating power with no clear end use. So for them, there is this renewable opportunity, and they've got, in a lot of cases, water as a liability, and they've got to treat water on an ongoing basis. And those are the two key ingredients to create green hydrogen. So we could become this massive player in the global hydrogen.
Could be, and we could be lots of different things. What did Desmond Tutu say? We're a sparkling success just waiting to happen. I think he said that 20 years ago. What is it going to take for us to take that leap to become, rather than talk about this land of infinite possibilities that never really come to fruition?
I think Nigel touched on it in talking about collaboration, right? So if we go on it at a single company by single company basis, we're going to have a lot of subscale, non-competitive entities. So we really, in this, where the numbers are big, and what we need to do, 150 gigawatts, we've got 34 functioning right now. So that's, just under 5 times a build of what we've got working today. So that is not going to be solved by one company alone. So we've got to get companies together, and we've got to have industrial strategies. And I think there's a crucial role for government to play in that, in setting the right incentive structures. And in supporting that, they don't necessarily have to write checks. And this is a great thing, but you set the incentive structures for industry to follow.
Is the government getting better at those incentive structures, Julian?
This is a tough one to answer. I think that the answer is mixed. It's a yes and no. So we've got some really good policies in place. We've got really good practices. The renewable energy procurement was world class. And with colleagues, I think you're talking to in other videos who can touch on that. But that really set the precedent for how we go about procuring renewable energy. I think that we're a little bit weaker in, for example, green hydrogen, but we've got good policies in other spaces. Maybe Nigel is a little bit closer.
That's the hospital pass.
Yeah, it does sound like hospital pass. I think, maybe not so much from a kind of specifically government regulation, but I think we have specific technology in the country that's probably cutting edge. So, within Sasol, there's Fischer-Tropsch technology, where there's an ability to take hydrogen and essentially beneficiate it into a hydrocarbon that can be used, for example, sustainable aviation fuel. Now, that's a specific skill set or a technology that's unique to the South African environment. But that technology, that's what we're going to be jumping on.
Fischer-Tropsch technology goes back to Nazi Germany. I mean, Sasol hates it when you talk about it, and I can. But it's not. This is not brand new stuff. It's stuff that exists already, and Sasol has utilised it to convert coal into petrol, and into diesel fuel. It's been remarkable.
Exactly. So the idea is basically what you're doing is you're taking something and you're pivoting it towards the green economy, and that's exactly what we're talking about. So there's an ability for us to leverage that technology that sits within that specific corporate, and bring in certain other, whether it might be some of the mining houses, et cetera, and collaborate to try and build this out very effectively, and potentially use some of the infrastructure, the gas infrastructure in the future. So you're going to need some type of transition fuel. And this is one of the areas of debate is, what role does gas play in this? Some people feel, gas shouldn't play a role at all. Some people feel that gas is a transition.
But is it possible to do this without a transition? I don't know if it is, unless you switch off everything for 10 years while you try and build.
Well, the question is, do you just continue with the status quo that we have at the moment and kind of prolong where we are until kind of the technology is available? Or do you implement the gas option, which is kind of seen as the transition? In my mind, I think that the gas option makes sense because I think we need a transition.
Critics, though, Phil, would say to you, hold on a second, but what you're going to do now is going to create the gas transition, and then that'll last for, that'll have a lifespan of 15 or 20 years, and nobody will want to cut that short. And so actually it delays a transformation of this move towards net zero, postpones it almost.
I do feel that time is needed. You know, it's amazing that the amount of change, as Nigel was talking about, just since COP22, COP26 now, just how much corporates have moved, and to the extent to which people are starting to get the idea now. A gas is a transition. I do feel buys some time for people to, corporates and government, to start to get their ducks in a row in terms of planning for this. So. But
don't we have a crisis on our hands? I mean, do we not need to be fast-tracking rather than constantly leaning back and go, we need some time. We need some time until everyone's comfortable, by which time, we're 2 degrees warmer, the weather patterns have changed and the planet is potentially irreparably harmed. Is this not a state of emergency situation where you actually need to be a little bit more robust?
It is that, but in South Africa it's so complicated, right? 400,000 plus jobs in coal, similar amounts in automotive, agri sectors. So to simply just say, we're shutting down all coal-fired power stations right now is very challenging to navigate.
And we've also got to remember our place in the world. I mean, we kind of regard ourselves as filthy and dirty and all of those sorts of things in terms of the way we generate our power and the way we make our fuel and all of that sort of stuff. But in terms of global emissions, we are but a tiny speck in terms of global emissions. So do we need to go a little easier on ourselves in terms of the transition, Nigel?
And this is an interesting point. So I think as a continent, your point is right, but I think as a country, it's not necessarily. Yeah. So we're in the top 20.
Yeah, but we're part of a continent. We're part of a continent.
So if you that's exactly it. So it depends on how you look at it. Now, our emissions per GDP are quite high, and I think there is work to be done. I think the difference is, what we need to, and this goes back to our original session, is we need to be thinking ahead. Yeah. So we need to be strategic. So what we're saying is that if you're going to install gas infrastructure, there needs to be a sunset clause. When is that going to end? In other words, so there must be a point in life where you say this is going to end, but what are you going to use that infrastructure for? So it can't be a case of, well, now we've got a whole lot of, essentially a redundant infrastructure. The idea is, well, no, that infrastructure is then going to be used for the green hydrogen. So it's not lost. And that's how we've got to start thinking. We've got to start thinking what will come next, and what we build now has also got to look at that.
I mean, you would have, on your way to the airport, driven past the old power station, I forget which one it is, that had the cooling towers outside in Pinelands, and those were imploded. It's this magnificent clinker brick building, which is reminiscent of the coal-burning past of Cape Town generating its own power at that particular site. And again, what a beautiful piece of property, what a glorious piece of real estate, and it's underutilized. It's not used for anything anymore. And we've got to prevent those sort of white elephants being left behind as a legacy of this. So utilizing old tech, utilizing old structures, utilizing this as part of this transition is possibly the answer.
Yeah, I think it's really good. And I guess it does, in some sense, loop back to Nigel's point earlier on around Fisher-Tropsch and are there technologies we can use. For me, what's really interesting is, are there ways in which, we speak so much around the big picture components to coal-fired power stations, everything we've got to do there, but there are other opportunities in terms of, to what extent are mines looking at rehabilitating their land? Is there more we can do in sequestering carbon around how we treat our sort of large-scale land areas? Are there jobs which can be provided for people planting trees, for, removing alien vegetation and all the water benefits it brings? So, yes, there are kind of very real steps which we need to take in terms of looking at our existing legacy, but always being so cognizant of, how can we be providing jobs, new forms of training to allow people to transition in that process?
I think maybe, Julian, one of the biggest revolutions I've noticed is how the discussion around ESG, even without using the terms ESG, has become very, very mainstream. A friend of mine bought a wine farm and has taken out all of the aliens, and instead of burning them or chipping them and sending them off to garden centres, has reinterred that carbon into the soil to rehabilitate the soil, for example. These are wine farmers, and going to huge expense doing precisely that in order to try and get a sustainable future for their own business. And on that small scale, multiplied 10,000 times, you really start seeing a positive impact towards net zero.
Well, look, I think what's being lost in that conversation a lot of the time is the S and the G. And this is what the just transition is all about. So one of our main frustrations is it's very easy to define good in the carbon context. And getting to zero is your target, and it's good, and we know that you can transition there. But the S and the G are often where the just aspect of it lies. And so, it's great for a wine farmer to be reinterring carbon, and we should definitely be doing that. But it's not the only thing, right? So the people who work there, what are their roles in this? And particularly in coal, mining coal is not a skill that's easily transferable into renewable energy or hydrogen. And, as Phil said, it's 400,000 people directly. In South Africa, that's, another 6 million potentially who are indirectly funded from those jobs. So it's a massive problem that we need to tackle, and this is why you don't turn it off for 10 years and just reset when you've got enough renewable power. And so I think we as financiers also have a key role to play in that, in helping guide these companies as, how are you thinking about these problems and how can we help?
So, and that's the point, Nigel. So how then does the just transition play out? How does it play out over the next 10 years?
Well, I think from a financial perspective, it plays out in the fact that we can play, as Julian mentioned, we can play this kind of coordinating role, bearing in mind that we obviously bank a lot of corporates, we bank a lot of supply chains, small, medium enterprises. There's an ability for us to look at these specific coal-fired power stations to the extent that they're going to be decommissioned. What's the secondary economy that can be built around? And that's what the key is. It's saying, what's the economy that's going to take over from that coal-fired power station that's going to keep everybody employed? What's going to give them jobs? What's going to, upskill them? And the idea is we need to be thinking about that. We need to be able to finance that and to be able to say, that's going to be the future for that specific area. And I think that's how it's going to play out. So the idea is to be looking at the different opportunities in the different sectors and then looking at that at a specific project level and a regional level as well.
So, Julian, one of the great advantages Africa has got in its favour is that it is a repository of an extraordinary number of battery minerals, for example, the sorts of commodities that go into providing the storage for these energy sources into the future.
And look, it's not just about storage. It's the batteries for storage, as well as the transmission infrastructure and the metals needed to create the electric vehicles going forward. Because you want to be moving to things like aluminium frames for lighter vehicles, so your power-to-weight ratio is improved. So there's a lot of the technical stuff in there. But I think that you're absolutely right in that we're very well positioned as a continent to be supporting that growth and the kind of greenification of the world. But there's a lot of challenges in that.
Exactly right. I saw quite a rabid and angry LinkedIn post the other day of saying, this is an oil pipeline. It goes through beautiful verdant forests. Look at it. It's absolutely clean. And here's a vanadium mine, a big hole in the ground. So there's political pushback on all sides towards this stuff. Mining is a destructive process. It's got to be managed incredibly carefully to ensure that the real benefit of this transition is met globally.
Look, I think that's one of the stories that miners don't really sell enough. And there have been dramatic changes in the way that mining is done globally over the past 50 years. So rehabilitation now is not what it used to be. And you can be in a forest in KwaZulu-Natal, and that was a mine 5 years ago. So the practices in this area are improving dramatically. And what's interesting, particularly in South Africa, with the private power procurement space, is that the miners are almost the leading edge of this. So we've got this sweet spot in that you've got a regulatory change upping the internal generation threshold and the miners being intensive users. So they're massively procuring renewable energy right now. So we're at the cusp of this kind of greenification of the metals that we produce in South Africa. So we can have green metals going into green processes. Now, unfortunately, we don't have massive endowments of things like copper and cobalt, which are more the remit of the DRC. But our miners have the necessary skills to locate and exploit mineral resources across the continent. And using the practices in terms of the renewable procurement they can develop here and the mining skills that we've got, we can be a leading force.
In terms of Nigel's earlier point on collaboration, again, it's an intercontinental collaboration, actually, that can lead to a speedier transition.
Look, and we don't even need to get that right? So that would be blue sky.
Yeah.
In the ideal world, we have an African Union that collaborates on this stuff. But I think that the economics are right. And as long as we kind of don't get in the way of this progress, the sensible capital will follow these opportunities. And we're trying to help channel that sensible capital into the right opportunities. So there's a big focus from our side into things like aluminium and copper, cobalt. And to the extent we can exploit that in the Southern African region, to lithium as well. And it doesn't need to necessarily be the case of Namibia and South Africa entering into a partnership. And you just need to have a sensible mining company with a long-term plan and responsible operatorship. partnered with a bit of capital, and off you go.
Gentlemen, thank you very, very much indeed. The just transition, it isn't as simple as switching off a light and hoping that all these things, these problems sort themselves out. It isn't a social media meme, and it certainly isn't an activist's angry protest. It is a very complex and unfortunately slow and sometimes torturous process, but it's a process we have to go through.